Chapter 10 of Alice or the Wages of Sin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simona Rusu. Alice or the Wages of Sin by Frederic Werden Pangborn. Chapter 10. Gathering of the Storm Clouds. Woe, woe, ill-fated one! My last word this only, and no more for evermore. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. The fall days were come, and things had relapsed into their former routine. The saddened household went about its customary rounds, and none of its members ever mentioned the name of the one who had brought disgrace upon its honorable name. The heart of the mother was sore, but she bore her trouble in silent patience, hoping for a day of forgiveness and the return of the prodigal. Mr. Dodger was, in his daily doings, the same as before, but he was never jolly now, as he had been at times in the past, and he had become stern in his manner and unsocial. Some natures are thus affected by grief or wrong. They never mellow under the hand of chastisement, or the pain of sorrow, but harden into silent austerity. Alice was not altogether unhappy, for she felt that brighter days would come and was hopeful. She knew that she was beloved, and she trusted in the honor of this lover who, for some reason, could not tell his love. Albert behaved much as formerly, but his fits of abstraction were often upon him. He felt himself accursed, and began to look upon his wife as upon one who had no right to stand between him and his desires. He had pitied her at first, now he hated her. She had become his enemy, and he sometimes found himself wishing that she would die and set him free. The wish was wicked, but it was a desire of nature and uncontrollable. One evening he received a note. It was from Cora. With mingled thoughts he opened it. It was a request that he would call on her just once, and she assured him that after that she would never trouble him again. "You surely will not refuse a dying woman's request," the note said. It contained an address in a miserable locality, and thither he went that night, feeling a sort of pity for the woman, now that she was nearing her end, and could not be a clog upon his freedom much longer. Thus do we often forgive those who can no longer injure us. He found her in a wretched room, in her bed, with a pallor of final sickness upon her face. He entered and stood beside her couch, waiting for her to speak. She gazed at him long and earnestly. "You do not hate me now, Albert, do you?" she said. "Hate you? No, Cora. I hope that I have never done that. You wronged me once, but that is past now. You asked me to love you again, but I could not. It was not my fault. I could not. But you will forgive me, Albert. I know you will. If you knew how I have yearned for you all these long years, repenting the rash deed, which I did not do, yet, having thought to do it, must bear its penalty in full, you would be full of pity for me. You would love me a little, only just a little perhaps, but you could not help loving me. I have suffered all that I can suffer for my sin. I have lost your love. Sometimes I have thought my punishment too severe, unjust even, but God knows best about that. It is enough for me to know that I have lost your love, and that I have no hope in life. I did think, Albert, that I might, by true penitence, win you back. I thought that these weary years of silence and honest remorse might awaken your love again, and give you back to me. When I met you that night by the water, I had hope, and I saw that you believed my story, but I did not know then. I know it now. You could not love me because you had learned to love another, and my coming was like a death blow to your hopes. Do not look at me so. I will not upbraid you, dear. She is perhaps better than I, but, oh, Albert, she can never love you more dearly than I do now, sinful, weak, penitent, and dying. But, Albert, she, that woman— Please talk of something else." The words were cold and cutting, and the woman shuddered. "Albert, dear," she continued after a pause, "you must hear me this time, because it will be the last, and because it is for your good that I wish to speak to you. Oh, do not refuse to hear me now, or you may regret it all your life. Albert, tell me truly, have I guessed right? Do you love this Alice?" "Better than my own immortal soul," he murmured, scarcely knowing what he answered. "I knew it, Albert. My instinct guided me all right. You love Alice. She is good and noble, But, oh, my husband, when I am dead and gone, you must not wed that woman." "Peace, woman!" The words came sternly and coldly. "Peace, I say!" "I cannot obey you," she cried, rising in her couch, her face flushing with a fever redness. "I cannot hold my peace, Albert, by the love you once bore me, by the love I bear you now. I implore you, a dying woman implores you, Albert, not to love that woman. She must never be your wife. She cannot. She shall not. I tell you to hold your peace," he cried, "such as you shall not name her to me." "Oh, husband," she cried, springing from the couch and throwing herself at his feet, her rich dark hair flowing about her. "Oh, my husband, hear me, hear me. This must not be, Albert. Never could I rest in my grave if such a thing were to come on you. I love you, Albert, love you better than you know, and you must not love her. She— Cease, accursed woman! I will not listen to you. Oh, husband, curse me not, I love you so. I have much to tell yet, and if you will but hear me, you will cover my poor head with blessings, not curses, for the love I give you, when I might have been revenge for curse unjust. This Alice whom you love is not— Will you obey me, or shall I leave you here, fleeing from the sound of your polluting voice? Hear me, Albert. I will be brief. You cannot wed this woman whom you love. I will not allow it. I, your wife, forbid it. She— With an oath he flung her from him and fled. She lay unconscious on the floor a long time, and then crawling feebly to her bed, lay down and thought. And as she thought, her love, cherished so long, began to grow cold and turn to hate. This man whom she had loved all the long years, for whom she had suffered so much, whom she was willing to renounce forever, and to whom she had been ready to do a great service, this man had spurned her, had rejected the sacrifice which she was about to make. This man had scorned her, had cursed her, and she now began to hate him. And, as the hatred grew, its force came ever in increasing volumes of anathemas, until she hated him with a dangerous and vengeful hatred which, had she been able to act, would have boded him no good. But she was sick and dying, while he was well and prosperous. She hated him now for that. She hated him for everything that was of him or near to him. And thus she lay in her lonely bed, hating the husband whom she had loved so much during those 10 long years. When Albert, ashamed of his brutality and sorry for his rashness, returned next morning to ask a more amicable farewell from the woman who was, after all, his dying wife, he found that Cora was gone. No one about the place had seen her go out, and he could get no information of her whereabouts. He had come too late. Like many another penitent of this earth, he had come too late to save himself. He did not know it, but he felt unhappy that he had parted thus in anger from the woman who had been true to him so many years, and whom he did pity, although he could not love her. After this event, it is not strange that the announcement of the finding of a woman's body in the river that night attracted his attention, and that he went to the house of the unknown dead as soon as possible to see this drowned woman, whom no one knew. There she lay on the cold marble slab, what remained of a self-destroyed woman, driven to her doom by that most remorseless of all foes, circumstances, a foe against whom woman is less able to do battle than a man. Her garments were shabby, but the form which they covered was shapely, and would well have displayed the best of raiment, and the face— Albert felt a chill as he raised the cloth which hid it. A fair, sweet face, a calm, peaceful face now, whatever it may have been in life expression, oval and clear of skin, and enshrouded in a wealth of rich dark hair. It was a beautiful face, and Albert almost loved it again, now that it was his no more. Yes, it was Cora, beyond a doubt. He told the attendant that he could give him no information about the dead. How could he bear his life to the cold public gaze, and what good would it do if he should do so? He had met her, he said, but could tell nothing of her history, excepting that she had seemed friendless. But he would bear the expense of her burial. Of her death he knew nothing. This much he told, and no more. As he walked homeward, all the past came back to him, from the day when, in his mad infatuation, he had taken that fair woman to his heart, to this day when he had found her dead in the morgue. He felt sorry that their final meeting had been such as it was, that they had parted in anger. A kindly parting would have been better, but it was over, and he was free. Free! He felt that he must scream that word aloud in the street. free, free to walk abroad with no secret in his heart, free to do as he pleased with his affections, free to woo Alice in honour, free to marry her. He hurried along, and ringing the bell of Mr. Dojere*s house, called for Alice. Soon she came to him, and there, in the quiet of the old house, he told her of his past, of Cora, of her return to life, of his love for herself, of his unhappy parting with the wife who was a clog to his life, of her death. Oh, hold! He did not tell her of Cora's mention of herself. Perhaps he could not. He attributed it to mere jealousy at the most. All but that, and Alice heard him. She said no word to interrupt the tale, but at its close she placed her hand in his and raised her trusting face up to be kissed. No proposal of marriage had been made, but they knew, and were happy. Ah, race of mortal men, how as a thing of naught I count ye, though ye live. For who is there of men that more of blessing knows, than just a little while to seem to prosper well, and having seemed, to fall. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Alice, or The Wages of Sin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simona Rusu. Alice, or The Wages of Sin, by Frederic Werden Pangborn. Chapter 11. The Calm Before the Storm. Mene, mene, tekel ufar sin. It was winter, and the Christmas season was not far off. The sorrows of the family had become as a wound which kindly time has scarred over, and quiet serenity reigned in Mr. Dojere's home. Tonight, however, the usual calm of the family is ruffled, for it is the night of a wedding, and Alice has but now become the wife of her foster father's young partner. The wedding has been a quiet one, witnessed only by a few intimates, and the happy pair are soon to leave for a short tour, returning in time for the Christmas Eve reunion at the old home. Alice is very happy in this climax of her long, silent loving, and Albert is happier than he remembers ever to have been before, for this union is, he feels, in reality a joining of two souls with but a single thought, two hearts that beat as one. Friendship may be the joining of two souls with but a single thought, love the union of two hearts that beat as one, but marriage, to be marriage in its highest sense, must be the union of soul with soul and heart with heart, and few there are who find this boon. If such a union be possible on earth, surely that of two such beings as these just married gives promise of it. The ceremony and all that follows a wedding ceremony being over, the time for the goodbyes had arrived, and Alice, in her travelling robes, having bid farewell to the good souls who had given her parents care and love, went out into the cold, snowy night, leaning upon her husband's arm. Albert placed her in the carriage, and was about to follow himself, when a person touched his arm, and turning about, he beheld that which seemed to freeze the blood in his heart, the face of Cora Tate, pale, wan and passionless, but with a baleful glitter in its eyes. He tried to speak, but could not command his voice, and only stared. The time seemed to him long, but it was only a few seconds since she had touched him, when she spoke. "Albert," she said, "you were too willing to think me dead. You did not look well at that other's face. You would not listen to me when you thought me dying. You would not come near me when you thought me dead. You have punished me more than was your right. You scorned me when I gave you loving penitence. You spurned my dying counsel, and would not hear my warning voice. I hate you now. I leave you to your fate. Go!" Then the voice, which had been subdued and mellow, ceased, and she was gone. He never had any clear recollection of what followed, except that he found himself in the carriage beside his wife, and that he was telling her some lie or other about an importunate beggar. Alice, with woman's quick perception, saw that he was troubled, but with a wisdom not often possessed by woman, dropped the matter then and there, and never spoke of it again. She made up her mind that she would never look into the past again, but would devote herself to the happy now. There was wisdom in this, and many a married pair would be happier were the wife to adopt this plan of living. Men are not prone to inquiry into the past of their wives. They believe them pure, and, as a rule, battle against the very idea of thinking otherwise. But women often allow themselves to pry back into the past of their husbands, and in so doing sometimes render a once assured happiness void, and make for themselves a future of senseless jealousies and miserable discomfitures. This was an error into which Alice did not allow herself to drift. So the wedding tour was, after all, a pleasant one, and unmarred by any disagreeable events. Albert, to be sure, was occasionally moody and seemed absorbed in sombre thoughts, but he managed to keep them out of notice most of the time, and Alice did not often allow him to brood alone. As to Albert, his condition of mind was one which he himself could not have described. He sometimes found himself almost believing that Cora was really dead, and that the face in the street was only a vision. Yet he knew better. He knew that she was alive, and that he had made a hasty mistake when in the morgue. "Albert, you were too willing to think me dead. You did not look well at that other's face." The words came back to him with terrible force. He had been too willing to believe her dead. It was true. Had the dead woman in the morgue been Alice? Would he have given her but a passing glance? Ah, no. He knew it well now. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and one not to be remedied. The more he pondered on these things, the more he determined not to alter his course. He could not give up that which he had gained, and which he might still retain if he could only find the means to silence this terrible witness. And he had money. With money he had saved Joe, and why not himself? Cora was alone, without friends, and an outcast. While he was powerful, she could be silenced, or, at any rate, if the worst came, suppressed beyond belief. He knew that he was becoming a villain at heart already, but the words of Cora had put him on his mettle. And now that the die was cast, he meant to fight for Alice, if need be. He never would have married her, knowing Cora to be alive, but he had married her honorably, and the fault was not his. Thus he reasoned with himself and with his warped conscience. It was the best that he could do, he thought, and he mapped his course accordingly. So they went away on their bridal tour, happy in each other, but with a little shadow of the cloud, no bigger than a hand, over them. Happy as they were, Alice felt the shadow of the cloud. Albert felt the shadow of the cloud, but unlike Alice, knew that it was not the shadow of a cloud passing away, but of one rising and spreading over the horizon. How great or how little the storm behind it might be, he knew not, but he felt its coming with ominous dread. Like the monarch of old, he saw the writing on the wall and knew it was of evil portent, yet could not read its meaning, but it troubled him. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Alice, or the Wages of Sin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simona Rusu. Alice, or the Wages of Sin, by Frederic Werden Pangborn. Chapter 12. The Storm Cloud Bursts. Could we but know the working of our deeds, but tear the veil apart and see the end, the horrid climax of some petted scheme might turn us from a foeman to a friend. Woe, 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 all cometh clear at last. O light, may this my last glance be on thee, who now am seen owing my birth to those to whom I ought not, and with whom I ought not in wedlock living. Christmas Eve, Albert and Alice had arrived home the day before, and tonight were to be present at a social gathering in Mr. Dodger's house. It was early, as yet, and Albert had gone out for an hour to attend to some matters in which Santa Claus and the children are supposed to be jointly interested, leaving Alice in her pretty little room. Alice was very happy tonight, happy in her love, happy in the love of her husband, and happy in her peace of mind and purity of soul. The little cloud which had dimmed the glory of her sunshine for a brief time had vanished entirely during her wedding tour, and Albert had been himself again. She sat in the pretty little easy-chair which he had given her, and glancing about the room, with its every colour and fitting bespeaking Not only the good taste of its furnisher, but his love for her was filled with this happiness unspeakable. Here, in this sanctum sanctorum of their little home, would they pass the happiest hours of their lives. Here they would read together, here talk in soft tones of their mutual joys, and here, it might be, they would retire together in sorrow. Here she would be loved by the husband whom she worshipped, as the women of the mythologies worshipped their god-lovers. Here her children would be born, here their proud father would first gaze upon them and upon her with that tenderness which comes to manhood at the birth of its offspring and the safety of its best beloved. Here should be her home, her rest, her holy of holies. Thus she sat dreaming in the innocence and purity of her woman's soul. Did you ever see a gentle dog in company with its master gazing at him with that trustful fondness, so common in the dog when it has a kind ruler? How happy the creature seems in this perfect faith. Someone unseen now discharges his murderous gun at the unsuspecting creature, and the death-dealing bullet pierces its side. Note the change from joy to misery, the sudden turning with rage at the person who has intended the wrong, as it thinks to its beloved master. Then let it slowly dawn upon the creature's mind that it is the master himself who has done this wrong, and it may flee from him in terror, but it loves him still. It is a theme worthy of a poet's pen. Such is the love of woman for the man who, having won her affections, wrongs her. As Alice sat thus musing in her room, a servant announced that a poor woman was without who wished to speak to her. She said she must see you herself, ma'am, said the maid. Let her come into the reception-room, said Alice. I will see her there. She went below in a minute, and in the room met a tall, finely built young woman, very shabbily dressed. Her face bore traces of beauty, but it also bore the marks of incurable disease. What she might have been it was difficult to imagine, but handsome she certainly had been. Alice motioned her to a seat, but she refused with a nod and remained standing. "Are you the wife of Albert Thornbury?" inquired the visitor. "Yes." "Do you love him very dearly?" "What do you mean by such questions as these?" said Alice calmly, but flushing at the manner of the stranger. "No matter what I mean," replied the woman, "I have something to tell you." "If there is anything I can do for you," said Alice. "There is nothing you can do for me," said the woman. "I have a letter for your husband, that is all. I believe you are a woman who would not tell a lie. You look like one." "I should hope so." "Then, if I give this letter to you, you will deliver it to your husband." "Certainly." "Will you also read it first yourself?" "I do not generally read my husband's letters." "Then you cannot have this one." "But why should I read it, pray?" "Because it concerns you more than it does him." "Very well, I will read it then, and I wish you to read it now. It is not sealed, as you see. Read it now." And the woman handed her a stained yellow piece of paper in an equally much stained envelope, and stepping back a pace, waited for Alice to read. As Alice read the blurred and faded writing, the woman watched with evident intense interest. The letter was dated October the 18th, over 18 years before, and read as follows: "Dear Albert, the end is at hand. Deserted by you and left to perish alone, I have borne all that I can bear. I do not ask you to think tenderly of me. You have used me too cruelly for that. But I want you to know what has become of our baby, for she is our baby, born in true wedlock, whether you own her or not. I have left her at the house of my father's old friend in the hope that my sister will take her and be good to her. She will never know whose child she is caring for, but I have placed my locket, the one which you gave me when you loved me, upon her neck, with a note requesting that she be told when she grows up that she must always keep it for her mother's sake. You will know the locket, and should you ever find her, be good to her, for she is your daughter, and injure her not, for the sake of her mother, whom you destroyed. I shall never trouble you again. I go to meet my God tonight. May he forgive you for the wrong you have done your wife. Mary Morton Thornbury." The letter was addressed Mr. Albert Thornbury, Care, Dodger and Company, London. Alice read the letter in a bewildered way, not half comprehending its import, but she knew that it was brought for the purpose of doing her husband harm, and it angered her. "Have you read it?" said the woman. "I have," said Alice, "and I desire that you, villain, liar, forger, as I am sure you are, leave my house at once." "You promised me, and I will keep my promise," cried Alice, flushing with anger. "My husband shall have the letter, and will probably know how to deal with the blackmailer who originated it. Leave me at once." "Certainly, madam, with pleasure. If you should want any witnesses as to the genuineness of the letter, there is an address," throwing a card upon the table. "Good evening," and the woman went quietly from the room. Somehow the sight of that pure girlish face unnerved her, and deprived her of all desire to see her suffering. "It will be enough to know that he is punished," she said to herself as she went forth into the snowy night. She loves him, she muttered, "and my God, so do I," and she hurried away. Alice, now that the woman had departed, began to think. She read the letter carefully to the end. It did not as yet enter her mind that this could be anything more than a scheme to levy blackmail upon her husband, but nevertheless there was one passage in the letter which puzzled her. Perhaps it was only coincidence, but it was strange. Of her own birth and parentage he knew nothing, excepting that she was an adopted daughter, and more than that she never had asked to know. The impression on her mind was that her parents were both dead long ago. Mr. and Mrs. Dodgers had been father and mother to her, and it had never occurred to her to think of any others as being such. But one thing in that letter troubled her. Not that it occurred to her to connect her husband with it in any way, but because it was a queer coincidence. She did have a locket which had come into her possession in a manner similar to that described in the letter. Mrs. Dodger had given it her on her 10th birthday, and told her that it had been left for her by her mother, with a request that she would always keep it, for her mother's sake. More than this Mrs. Dodger had never told her, and Alice had supposed that this was all that she knew. The locket was a peculiar trinket, quite large, heart-shaped, curiously engraved, and studded with a row of small diamonds, and bearing the inscription, "Till death does us part," in French. How could the writer of this vile letter have hit upon such an odd coincidence? She went to her jewel case and got the locket, and almost for the first time in her life began to wonder who her mother was, and to speculate upon the mystery of her parentage, and had almost forgotten the disagreeable letter in her meditation upon the other topic, when Albert entered. How handsome he was, fresh from the winter air, with a bright sparkle in his eyes, as he laid the mysterious Christmas bundles upon the table, slyly hiding one in his pocket, and came to her. He leaned over her and gently kissed her beautiful hair. He did not see the letter on the locket, for they lay in the shadow, and he was too intent in gazing upon the dear face that he loved to notice surroundings. "Why this look of worriment on my pretty face?" said he, noticing the expression of her countenance. "Oh, Albert, such a visit as I have had since you went out. A strange woman came to me and brought a letter which, she said, was for me to read and give to you, a horrible blackmailing letter, and I have been so angry over it to think that any one could expect to make me think ill of you, darling. Here, you can read it and then throw it into the fire, or keep it as evidence to catch the villains if they ever come again." And, with love, trust, faith and confidence depicted in her bright eyes, she handed him the letter. He took it with an expression of curiosity and began to read it, carelessly at first, then slowly and attentively. An expression of pain and regret came over his face, so that Alice said, "Oh, don't let that thing worry you. Nobody is going to turn me against you, dear." "True, darling," he replied. "It is foolish to mind such sneaking things as this." He had composed himself by this time, remembering the presence of his wife, but he was thinking with painful intensity. For him there was no doubting the genuineness of the letter. The handwriting of Mary Morton he knew at once, and this letter brought on a Christmas Eve in the honeymoon of his only happy marriage was like a visitor from the grave. It explained nothing clearly, but it told him that Mary was, without doubt, dead, and it told him also that there was someone in the world, either a living child of his own, or a grave containing her remains. Which? Were this child alive, how much might she know or not know? Mary's letter told him that the child, his babe, had been left at the house of Mr. Dodger. Neither Dodger nor his wife had ever mentioned the fact. It would not be like Dodger, if he knew that such was the case, to hesitate to tell him, Albert, about it, and to censure him soundly for the whole affair. Probably it was Mary's intention to leave her babe there, but something had prevented. And again, how came it happen that the letter should be so long delayed, and then delivered in such a manner? That certainly did look like blackmail, but the writing, it was surely that of his first girl love. Could Mary have known Cora? No, that was impossible, yet somehow he began to think that Cora might have been the bearer of the letter, and he was pondering over this, when Alice speaking aroused him from his thoughts. Anyhow, he thought, she shall never know that it is anything but a spurious document. Never mind the letter, dear, said she, but let me tell you something singular. You see, the letter mentions a locket left by a mother for her babe. You know, I am only an adopted child of Mr. Dodger, and is it not strange that, as a coincidence, I should have a locket which my mother left for me, with an injunction similar to that described in this foolish letter? See, here it is, dear. You have probably never noticed it, as I seldom wear it, fearing that it might be lost, and she placed the locket in his hand. Albert took it mechanically. His thoughts had begun to become strangely confused while his wife was speaking, and looked at it at first quickly, then with a steady gaze full of amazement, terror, and conflicting emotions. Alice was frightened at his appearance. She started to speak, but he moved his hand in a manner which stilled her at once, and filled her with a nameless fear. For a long time Albert gazed upon that locket. He knew it well. It was one made to his own order for Mary Morton nearly 20 years before, and he knew it. His gift to Mary, Mary's gift to her child, to his child, and the gift to his wife from her mother. There could be no doubt. The beautiful woman before him was his daughter. He looked at her, a searching, piercing look that chilled her heart, and as he looked he began to see a resemblance, faint but true, to the sweet girl whom he had basely ruined and deserted. Thought after thought came pouring over his mind, and as the truth, the terrible truth of bold facts became clear, a sound of anguish, such as few ever utter, burst from his lips, and with a cry like that of the fate-stricken Oedipus, a cry of horror and anguish, he rushed from the room, and Alice heard him hurrying through the halls and into his library, closing the door behind him. Then all was still. How long she remained there in terror she never knew, but she was aroused by the entrance of a servant, who said that Mr. Dodger was below and had come to ask what delayed her and Mr. Thornbury so long. Alice had always loved this strangely bluff old gentleman as a daughter should, and she went to him at once. "We had begun to think that you were sick, daughter," he said as he kissed her. "Why have you not been at the house? And where is Albert?" Filled with a nameless terror, she handed him the letter and the locket, and fleeing from his presence, before he could restrain her, she hurried along the hallway to the library. She opened the door gently and entered the room. He was not there. On a table was a note which she knew at once to be for her from her husband. It merely told her to read some letters which were laid on the table, and she would know all. There were 2 of them, and they were in the same handwriting as the first received that evening, and bore the signature, "Your loving wife, Mary M. Thornbury." Slowly and surely the light began to dawn upon her clouded thoughts. Mary Morton, her baby, his baby, left with Mrs. Dodger. The locket, herself and the locket and Mary Morton and Albert Thornbury, her husband. As to a man walking in the dark along a road, the flash of the lightning reveals the sudden presence of a deadly serpent in the act of springing at him, so at the silent mention of her husband, the whole truth flashed upon Alice. It was all true, the letter was genuine, and he knew it. Her husband was her father. She was his daughter, basely deserted in her infancy, to be more basely debased in her womanhood. A sickening horror filled her high-bred soul. Her head was all afire within, her brain seemed filled with horrid fumes, a sense of loathing for herself came over her, and with a moan of woeful timbre, she staggered across the room, and parting the drapery between the library and reception-room, stopped on the threshold, transfixed by a sight which met her gaze, a sight to touch Anne Hatred's self with pity. Albert Thornbury lay upon the floor, dead. With a cry of love, for love will live when other senses are dead, she fell upon the corpse and covered it with kisses. Surely she might love him now that he was dead. But a second thought came. Mary Morton was dead, and Mary Morton was his wife, while she, what was she? Worse than anything of which society can conceive, worse than the commonest of the common, lower than the lowest. Hastily rising, she hurried to her room, just as Mr. Dodger, who had been trying to make something out of the letter which she had given him to read, entered the parlour and found the dead body of his partner lying upon the floor. With the help of a man-servant, whom he summoned quickly, he carried Albert to his room, summoned a doctor, and took possession of the house. He sent for his wife, and then, telling her briefly what had happened, sent her in search of Alice. Then he read the letter again, and also those found in the library, thought a while, and perceived the truth. As he roused from a chair, with a heart heavier than he had ever known before, his wife met him at the door, her face full of terror and her eyes running with tears. Alice was nowhere to be found. She had fled. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Alice, or The Wages of Sin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Alice, or The Wages of Sin, by Frederic Werden Pangborn. Chapter 13. Be sure your sin will find you out. To eyes which spoke and said, sleep, dreams, and death, we are only gods that answer prayer. With the faint gleam of the tender evening light there came a human form, barefooted, bareheaded, with broken limbs of golden chains gleaming here and there upon her limbs, with white robes hanging heavily, soaked with dews and rains, and fell at the feet of Thanatos. She had fled, even as her mother, nearly 20 years before, had fled from her home, with her burden of shame and her breaking heart, to bury her crushed soul and outraged womanhood in oblivion. So Alice now fled from all that was dear to her. In the short hour which had turned her happiness to agony, she had lost all care for life, all yearning for friendships, all desire for love. One idea alone now filled her mind, an idea which had never before come to her. Now she cared not to see ever again the faces of those to whom she had been so dear. The kind friends, the tender foster parents, the once beloved husband, were all alike to her objects of terror. But one idea filled her soul, and one creature alone in all the universe had a place in her heart. She yearned for her mother. To this one person of all the universe she yearned to go, and she was dead. With a sense that God had entirely deserted her, she felt that mother, and mother alone, would have taken her in, loathsome as she had become in her own sight, and given her comfort. She had now, out of all the mass of confused thoughts which filled her brain, but one idea. Hurrying along in the chilly winter night, she bore in her hand the card which the horror-bringing messenger had left. As she hurried along the streets, she was conscious that it was a gala night, that the store windows were ablaze with lights, that happy people were jostling past her as they bore their Christmas burdens to happy homes, and that the world was gay. The world was happy, but it was no longer her world. For her, there was now no world, past, present, or future. She was the one of all the world who was unlike all the rest, and a terrible sense of loneliness came upon her. She met a party of bad women in company with worse men. She was lower than they. How they would laugh in scorn could they know her story. As she passed them, one of the men spoke to her, but she was not offended. Why should she be? She had fallen lower than he or his companions. You smile at her illogical ideas, but would the world tomorrow be more just to her than she was to herself? On she goes through the streets, turning here and there as she notes by the lettering on the lamp posts the course she wishes to take. At last she has reached her destination. She enters the wretched den of Isaac, and inquires for Cora. The old man informs her that he does not know who she is. He is frightened, for he is not certain that this visit may not forebode some trouble for himself, and when she abruptly tells him her name and her errand, he is only too glad to do that which she asks, and which he alone can do. Donning his old hat and coat, the aged man goes forth with her into the night, and something of pity, if not regret, touches him as he looks at the woebegone face of the girl whom he has helped to ruin. Through the streets together they go, the once proud and happy lady of refinement and culture, and the sordid Jew. On they go, Alice walking in silence, while Isaac leads the way. He does not understand what this journey means, but he is afraid not to obey, so on they go, until at last they come to a graveyard. Tracing the way carefully among the stones and mounds, old Isaac leads her to a remote corner of the plat, and, by a sign, indicates a certain grave. "Are you sure?" she asks. "I am, my lady, for I followed her here myself, nigh 20 years ago, and marked the spot," he replies. "Very well, you may go," she says, and hands him her purse. Mechanically his sordid hands grasp his god, and he moves away, wondering whether he has done a wise thing or not. He is gone, and she is alone at last with the only thing in the universe for which she cares, her mother's ashes. She feels a sense of peace stealing over her shocked and anguished soul, and fancies she feels a presence near her. She knows it is her mother, for it allays the terrible yearning which has been her agony this dreadful night. She is not certain just how long it may have been since she fled from that horror, but it has been a long time, anyhow. This is her mother's grave. "Mother, mother," she keeps repeating the soft word over to herself, and it seems to do her good. And she never knew her, never knew this sweet woman who loved her, this long-suffering woman who died for her in the hope that she might be saved to an honorable life. Perhaps, after all, it is better as it is. Had she learned her mother's story in a different way, she might have wronged her in her heart. Now she adores her as a saint. It is not so dark as it was. Morning must be near. The thought of daylight brings a dread to her heart. She must not wait so long. Her mother must come soon and take her. She feels that this will be so, and that all she has to do is to wait. It is chilly, but she hardly notes it, and a drowsy feeling is stealing over her. She seems to be half alive and half in a trance-like state, and again she feels that gentle presence. How soothing it is, how full of restfulness. She must have had some feeling as this when, a little babe, she fell asleep in her mother's arms. She is asleep and dreaming, but no, that vision was too vivid to be a dream. Fair, sweet face, tender eyes, this is no dream. It is mother. A soft sigh, and Alice is asleep, peaceful, quiet sleep, such as comes only to the innocent of heart and pure of soul. They found her next morning, dead, in the neglected corner of the burial ground upon one of the pauper graves. Neither Mr. Dojere nor his wife ever knew why she had gone there to die. Only God and her mother held that secret. They buried her beside her false husband, for it was best that it should so be done, and the horrid secret of their lives was buried with them. The grave keeps its own counsel, so long as men disturb it not, and there were none who cared to invoke secrets from these graves. So let them rest. She, the fair, unsullied soul, so fit to live, so fit to die, prepared for either state. He, the noble and ignoble, who thought that repentance alone, without reparation, could atone for wilful sin, and of whom it is best to say, no further seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from the dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God. The tale is told. In the quiet of the grave, among the silent multitudes of bygone years, crumble the remains of Albert Thornbury. In the narrow bed next to him lies the woman whom he loved with tenderness of manhood's strong passion, and whom he knew, too late, could never be his wife, whom he blasted in her womanhood, and against whom he sinned, unconsciously but beyond redress. She lies in the wife's place, but she is not his wife. In the far corner of the same plat, unknown, unmourned, forgotten, is another grave, and in it lies the woman who is his wife, and against whom he sinned guiltily. 3 graves, containing the wrecks of 3 lives destroyed by a boy's sinful mistake. Be sure your sin will find you out. Men repeat the words often, but they do not believe them to be true. Could we raise the impenetrable curtain of time and see the scene behind? Could we foresee the end of our bad beginnings, this might become an almost sinless world. Could the thoughtless girl, coquetting in her innocent sense of safety, toying with the double-edged tools which, sooner or later, cut back and rend the heart with merciless stabs, blighting the life and making a double terror of death, foresee the end, she would be more careful of herself and value less than she does the empty gratifications of vanity. Could the venerated pastor, seeking the companionship of the women of his congregation, ever too readily to fall in love with their father-confessor, meaning perhaps no harm, foresee the intricate meshes of the toils into which he is weaving himself, he would be more circumspect in his conduct. Could the young man, lightly trifling with the loves of women, knowing little of the power of that delicious poison which destroys body, soul, and mind, know the danger which lurks behind the golden glories of such delights, and see the work which time will develop, he would seek his mother oftener, and the soft-skinned beauties of his choice would lose, for him, many of their charms. Could the man of business, misapplying the trusts in his charge, a little here, a little there, falsifying his accounts, robbing this one to deceive that one, covering his tracks skillfully, and, as he thinks, forever foresee the end, the disgrace, the ruin, the never to be rectified wrong which he is doing himself, his dealings would be honest, and his conduct above reproach and honorable. We see it not, we have no faith in the words. They apply to others, but not to ourselves. Our sin will not find us out. Albert Thornbury little thought that the sin of 20 years' oblivion would never come back to him. Little did he suspect that in the very moment of his greatest happiness, when all the troubles of his life were at rest, when he had at last found the one thing needful to fill the vacant place in his man's heart, little did he think that at this moment of self-satisfaction the horrible truth would be forced upon him that his sin had found him out. And more terrible even than this comes the dreadful truth of that other awful warning, the truth of which is proven in moral and physical life at all times, that the sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children, innocent and guilty alike, to bear the yoke of sorrow and to feel the stern grip of the hand of punishment, cruel, unjust, diabolical, no doubt, but a fact. We see it in the everyday meeting of our fellows. The morally warped, the socially degraded, the sinfully diseased, the hopelessly insane, all bear witness of this dreadful truth. Whether there is justice or sense in such a law, whether it be divine or devil-bred, we cannot say, but it is a law, an inexorable, terrible, awful fact. Be sure your sin will find you out. If not during your life, perhaps in the lives of those whom you leave behind you, to struggle through their lives, handicapped by your folly, cursed by your sins. Could the millions today laboring under the blight placed upon them by their fathers behold as in a panorama the deeds for which they now are doing penance, being innocent themselves, there might be an uprising of indignation, a pouring out of the vials of wrath, a panic of cursings and reproach, such as the God of the Jews himself could scarcely hope to hurl from his high throne above. Be sure your sin will find you out. This has a significance more than personal, wider in its application than the laws of nations or the religions of the world. The man who loves his honor, the man who loves his posterity, the man who loves mankind, and if one be not such a man as this, he is but little higher than the breeding bull or the protozoon, which parts from its budded offspring, never to meet it again, must ever bear this truth in mind. If he is sure that his sin will find him out, reading the injunction in its broadest meaning, he will be careful lest he sin. These words carry with them no promise of pardon, no hint of forgiveness, no hope of absolution. They are plain, terse, and not to be misunderstood. They are the embodiment of all warnings against wrongdoing, and the succinct codification of unalterable, inexorable, passionless law. Be sure your sin will find you out. End of chapter 13. End of Alice, or the Wages of Sin, by Frederic Werden Pangborn.